Yeah, hi everyone. Very good evening. And yeah, today we're going to discuss about EUDR, an interesting topic. What is EUDR? For whom it is applicable? What are the timelines? I think, as many of you know, that it has been postponed for another year. So now, for yeah, sorry for that. So as you know, that it has been delayed for another year for large companies. So which means the starting timeline for yeah, EUDR reporting is from 30th December 2026, and for small and micro companies, it's mid of 2027. But it is very important that you already know about EUDR and you can already start preparing the data if this is applicable for you. So let's dive into it and see what is EUDR and how you can already start planning for it for the next year. And how Artemission can also help you with this process. So before getting into the details, so it's pretty self-explanatory. EUDR, what does it mean? EU Deforestation Regulation. So, and why it matters, right? So it is mainly introduced for the reason of preserving forests, for protecting the deforestation. And if you see that EU causes around 10% of global deforestation, and that is why it is very important to follow this. And if you see, there are only a few products where this is applicable for. For example, this EUTR applies to the commodities below, which you can see the coffee, cocoa, timber and wood products, palm oil, soy, rubber, and cattle, for example, like beef, leather. So if any of the EU states or EU countries, which comes under EU, if any of the countries or any of the companies within those countries, if they are importing or exporting any of these products, they have to comply with the EUDR reporting. So what does it mean? It means, for example, if there is a company which is importing coffee, for example, from Brazil, so it has to comply with EUDR rules and regulations to make sure that it doesn't come under this deforestation, and it has to do risk assessment calculation, due diligence, geolocation data mapping, and it has to track their supply chain and to see if it comes under low, medium, or a high risk um, category, and based on that, the data it needs to submit. And it is similar for all the other products as well. Okay, so what the law ensures? So it ensures that the products entering the EU must be deforestation free. And this is a post 2020. So any product, the products which we have seen in the slide, if any of these products, around seven, if they are entering the EU nations or any within any EU companies, they have to be deforestation free. And they should also follow the local environmental and land use laws, and they should include the plot level geolocation data, so from which location they are coming. So this is based on latitude and longitude data points, and it needs to thoroughly be done with the due diligence statements. And this applies to coffee, cocoa, timber, palm, soya, cattle, rubber, and derived products. Okay, and why it matters? Because EU causes around 10% of global deforestation. And if companies don't adhere to this law, and there are high penalties, around 4% of EU turnover, there could be a market ban within EU nations, and goods could be a seizure. But that is in the later stages, because this is still not in um, place yet, because they have delayed 1 year for this EUDR reporting based on the latest information. So who does this EUDR apply to? EUDR applies to operators, traders, right? For example, who are operators, companies placing products on the EU market. These are called operators. And for traders, companies making products available in the EU supply chain are called traders. and it affects to all the EU-based companies, non-EU exporters selling into EU, SMEs and large companies alike with proportional obligations as well. So the companies within EU and also non-EU exporting into EU, this affects to them and they should adhere to this reporting law. And why does EUDR exist? So we already discussed that because EU is being responsible for around 10% of global deforestation through imports. And because of that, they would like to limit it, right? Because of climate change, global warming, and they would like to preserve forests. And all the existing voluntary commitments are not really helping to stop the forest loss, and that is why they have started working on a policy or a regulation called EUDR, which is going to be in place next year end. And this deforestation, for example, if we keep it like that, and if we leave it like that, the deforestation, as we all know, that it drives to a climate change, biodiversity loss, and human rights violation. And to comply, companies must ensure the products are deforestation free. Whatever the products which we discussed should be deforestation free, and they should follow the local land use and environmental laws, and the due diligence statements should be submitted. And no product can enter the EU without meeting these conditions. So any EU nations, if they want to import any of these EUDR products, it has to adhere to these points. And what EUDR handles. So when it comes to EUDR, for example, so let's try to look it into two different aspects, right? One is the geolocation, because you can import products from different other non-EU nations or non-EU countries, like for example South America, from Asian countries, or from America. And it is very important that you submit the geolocation data from where the product is coming. And the other one is the risk assessment. So the risk assessment also gives you exposure towards the deforestation and the supply chain, how complex your supply chain is. So we'll look into the details in specific. For example, if you look at geolocation, so the EUDR requires exact latitude, longitude of production plots, and the mapping of farm boundaries, and it needs verification against the deforestation data, protected areas, legal land use status, right? So no geolocation, which means no complaints. And the same thing for a risk assessment. So the risk assessment considers deforestation exposure, country or regional risk level, land use legality, supply chain complexity, environmental and social risks, human rights indicators. So which means if the risk is high, the mitigation should be strong there. For example, there is a standard when it comes to EUDR, you have three different categories: low, medium, and high. So if a nation comes under low, then you don't really need to submit enough or thorough or depth information. But if a country comes in a high category, then it requires more and more data, and more auditing and more checks could happen on that process. And for example, let's say a risk is identified. So what happens if risk is identified? If risk is not negligible, right? Companies should or must apply additional documentation. There will be third-party verifications or audits. Satellite or forest monitoring evidence is required. Supplier corrective actions and in-house training and compliance improvements are also required within those companies. Okay, and so for example, if you look at the workflow of how EUDR compliance works, right? So the simplified EUDR flow always starts with identifying your supplier. So who is your supplier? And then supplier and product data collection, that's your step 2. Geolocation mapping is your step 3. And then risk assessment, followed by risk mitigation and due diligence statement monitoring and record keeping. So EUDR requires this end-to-end traceability, right? So let's say, I think you can take any example. For example, in this case, coffee. And if you are a coffee distribution company within Europe and you are importing coffee from Brazil, for example, so then you need to identify your supplier, of course, and you need to gather all the supplier information like the product, the data, and also the geolocation from where the coffee is being produced, the coffee, beans and the farms. And then you need to also do the risk assessment and the supply chain, the environmental risk, the climate risk, the social risk, the human rights, all this kind of information you need to do in the risk assessment. And then if the risk assessment is really high, then you also need to come up with a risk mitigation plan, how you're going to mitigate the risks. You also need to come up with a plan and put everything in your policies, and then due diligence statements, and finally monitoring and recording. Of course. So what happens if you don't comply, right? Again, of course, if there is a regulation and if you don't comply to regulation, it's pretty straightforward that you will be imposed with fines. So in this case, around 4% of EU turnover. It could also There could also be additional penalties like product seize, product seizure, EU market ban. Of course, you will have a reputational damage because once you are non-compliant, then you're already losing the brand image, and you have a reputational damage. And there'll be more and more inspections and audits once there is a red flag in your process. So once they identify there is a red flag in your reports, and then they'll do more inspections and audits to find more detailed information about your supply chain and risk assessment. And it could also be that you'll be excluded from the EU public procurement for up to 12 months, because these are like the lists from the EUDR, but it is always important that you should comply to these rules and regulations when it comes to EUDR if you're dealing with any of those 7 products. Yes. So how companies use EUDR compliance, because it really helps for you to be within the EU market, and it also helps for your company to reduce supply chain risk, because when you're doing the risk assessment, you also do the social, the climate, and also the human rights risks. And it also helps you to find the loopholes within your supply chain to also mitigate with the plan. And it helps for preparing future environmental regulations, because as you know, day by day, the environmental rules, laws are becoming more and more strict, and it helps you to build more traceable, resilient systems in your supply chain. Yeah, so I think we already discussed about the EUDR obligations by supply chain role. So mainly you have operators and traders. So if you have to get into details, the roles and the responsibilities of operators and traders, what kind of data they need to submit to the authorities is specific and very clear. For example, in this case, operators. So basically, operators are the companies placing regulated products on the EU market or exporting them, and they are responsible for full due diligence, collecting and verifying the supply data, assessing deforestation and legality risk, submitting due diligence statements before products are sold. So these things the operators have to keep in mind, and they have to do before the products are sold. Whereas for traders, so basically traders are these are distributors or retailers sourcing within the EU. So they have very lighter obligations. For example, ensure traceability, maintain relevant documentation, and most traders, especially small and medium enterprises, are not really required to perform a full due diligence, because they know that if you have to do a full due diligence, you need to have a dedicated teams. You need to, it requires a lot of data gathering, and yeah, because for traders, I think it's an overkill and it's not really required. So when they have come up with the framework of EUDR, they make sure that we also divide the roles and responsibilities, and who are the different stakeholders which are involved in this whole process. For instance, like operators and traders, so they have also divided them. So it's also very important to consider this. And if you also have to look more specific and more detailed into the due diligence process under EUDR. So the due diligence is at the core of the EUDR because for operators, it is legal requirement that must be completed before placing products on the EU market or exporting them, right? So the first thing always starts with collecting the data. So operators must gather, like, what's the product type and quantity, country of production, and the geolocation of all plots of data, evidence of compliance with the local land, labor, and environmental laws, proof that land used is deforestation free after 2020. And once the data collection is done, the second step involves with the risk assessment. Like I mentioned, first you need to evaluate the risk that products are not deforestation free or legally produced, considering like the country, the regional risk, the supplier credibility, the satellite, and the deforestation data. Once the risks have been assessed, then you start with the risk mitigation. If the risk is identified, let's say there is a risk in your supply chain workflow and it has been identified, so then it must be reduced to a negligible level before market entry, right? So, and this needs to be done through additional verification, third party audit, supplier changes if required. So, that is how you mitigate the risk. If you identified a risk with any specific supplier, from whom you are importing coffee, for example, and you already identified there is a big risk how they are producing the coffee, especially the human rights, maybe the climate risk maybe is really high with the way they are producing, and the land legality is not clear or the documents are not proper. In that case, you see the risk is already high, and what you need to do is either you know you need to bring it back to a negligible level by changing the supplier or by having a proper contract with the supplier saying that they need to change the way they deal with their own internal processes and they have to be compliant, and only then you start doing the business with them, things like that. So for this you need to have again third party audits, and additional verification is also required. So let's quickly dive and see how we do this using Earth emission, for example, right? So yeah, yes. So if you really talk about Earth emission, so Earth emission is a sustainability platform for sustainability reporting and carbon emission management. So we have quite few modules, wherein EUDR is one of the module. So it's pretty straightforward. We try to keep it as simple as possible. And if you see that, once you come to EUDR, you get overall progress to see what is the percentage. And here also you can see the supplier complaints tracker. But before even getting into that, so so usually you start with the supplier information, right? By logging the supplier information. So how does it look? Let me zoom in this a bit. Yeah. So when you create your account or when you're introduced to Earth Emission for the first time, you wouldn't see Brazil coffee because this is the test data which I have added here. So you always start with an empty overview where the supplier complaints tracker is all empty, and you always start with filling this information. So in this case, that let's say you are importing products, right? You as a company within Europe, and you are importing one of the EUDR goods, right? For example, coffee or palm oil, let's say. And this palm oil is actually coming from India. So what you have to do is you have to always start with adding the supplier data, right? So in this case, I've added for coffee the name of the supplier or the company and the address and which industry or which product you're, and of course the status, because there is also an approval workflow in this case. Okay, and of course you can also edit them, and you can also add a new supplier by manually adding them. Let's say you have 10 to 20 suppliers. You do want to do it manually. You can also do a bulk import by downloading the template. So in this case, if I click on manual, then you add a supplier name, the commodity, because it could be anything. In this case, it's a palm oil, and then you add the address, right? So once the supplier information has been added. So you need to follow the step-by-step approach which we discussed in the previous slides, right? So first thing always starts with collecting the supplier data, right? Let me go back to that slide. Maybe that's better. Yeah, so it always starts with identifying the supplier. That is something we did. And then collecting the data, then geolocation mapping, risk assessment, mitigation, due diligence, and monitoring. So if you look at the steps which we have in our platform, is also similar to what we've seen in the slide, which is always starting with the supplier data collection. So here you can see there are around 35 questions. So which starts with the name of your company, the full address, what is the legal entity of the company, if you have a designated officer for EUDR within your organization, and contact details, annual turnover, all basic information which is needed, and which product are you dealing with, like, which commodity are you dealing with, or which is relevant for you when it comes to EUDR for the EU market, like coffee or palm oil, rubber, soya, wood, or cattle, the derived products of cattle. Again, you need to list all the derived products, right? And the relevant products which are supplied, and quite few questions. Yeah. So around 35 questions, like I mentioned. So you need to fill in all these questions. And then, like we've seen, that you need to also provide the geolocation mapping data, which is also required for this. Latitude and longitude of the exact location or the plot where these commodities are produced. For example, in this case, it's coffee. So you also need to produce or provide the latitude and longitude of the coffee beans farm, the farm. Yeah. I think this is also something the EUDR simplified version is going to be changed for small and micro mid 2027, but it is not clear yet. But I think for now, they expect latitude and longitude information. And again, the size of the plot in hectares, right? Again, all the relevant information required for this farm or the plot where you're actually producing, okay? And how you're collecting the geolocation data. So either smartphone or using a GPS, could be any other ways. Yeah. So, and how frequently the data has been updated, the accuracy, and all the information related to the plot and the geolocation, right? So this is where you do the mapping of the geolocation with a list of around 33 questions. And then comes your risk assessment. So this is where I also mentioned that, as per the EU benchmarks, you basically have three different categories starting with low, standard, and high. So you need to already derive or define which category you belong to, whether it is low, standard, or high. And how do you know what is the definition? I think you can also get it from the EUDR website. And if possible, we'll also put it below this live as well. And once you identify that, let's say you come under standard, for example, then you select a standard, and then all the relevant questions are applicable for you. And yeah, for example, how do you assess the risk? Again, human rights, if there is any violation, indigenous peoples and land rights, any high risk suppliers. So it's all about assessing the risk, right, in your supply chain. So there are like around 32 set of questions where it assesses the risk in your entire workflow. And once the risk assessment is done, then comes the risk of mitigation. And with the risk mitigation, again, for each and every assessment, you also have to find the mitigation. In this case, there are around 35 set of questions which you also need to provide answers to. For example, do you provide suppliers with technical support for geolocation mapping? For example, it could be that you are importing goods from agricultural farmers from India, for instance, and they might not have all the technical knowledge required. They might not have all the technical knowledge needed for mapping the geolocation, right? So in this case, the question is, are you also providing the technical support for them to do the geolocation mapping, right? Especially in our application, you can also invite these suppliers to use the platform where you can send the invitation, and once they have the access, they would also be eligible to answer set of questions on your behalf for all the information which you want to collect from your suppliers. So in that case, you also need to provide them technical support because they might not really have all the knowledge to do it. And how do you track corrective action implementations, and how are your suppliers monitored regularly if the after the mitigation measures, all these kinds of questions. And if you have any collaboration with local authorities or NGOs for mitigation, it's all about mitigation and mitigation measures in your supplier and supply chain, right? And then finally we have this due diligence statement. So again, it starts with a standardized DDS template and how often you update, and yeah, again, all the questions related to your DDS and the template and all the information there. And once you fill in all this data, for example, in this case, we've only added Brazil coffee. Let's say you have around 10 suppliers, then you would see the progress, the list of all the 10 suppliers here. And also you can track the progress of all the 10 suppliers with all the information, making sure that whether you have 100% all the data gathered from them or not. And if you want to edit them, you can also do it from here. So in this case, it's just one supplier, which is a Brazil coffee, just a test data. And once the data has been logged, for example, it's not fully logged, it's just 27%. Well, let's see what the report shows here. So if you click on results and reports, so if you would have already added a proper geolocation data, then it would automatically, yeah, so bring the point into the map, showing that, for example, it's a Brazil coffee, the plot ID, and it also shows you the risk standard which we've added there, right? So yeah, I think this way you can also identify all the different suppliers coming from different locations in the geolocation map, right? And yeah, it also shows you the risks as well. And then you can yeah, you can also download the report and also an Excel report as well. So both the PDF and the Excel. So in this case, for example, if I generate, yeah, for example, the Excel report, you can already see the data has been properly structured with all the columns and fields with information provided. If it is provided, provided. If not, it says no answer provided, and the risk level also has been added there, right? So I think the data in the form of CSV or Excel is more useful if you want to do further data analysis, or if the data is like, if you want to further utilize this data into different dashboarding tools. And the PDF report, I think right now you couldn't generate PDF report because the data is not fully filled in, but usually once the data is fully filled in, then you can also see a nice PDF report as well. Yeah. So I think that is about the EUDR in short. I know I had to do it a bit fast because the theme behind EUDR is pretty much this. But I think there are quite few changes which are still happening, and we can also get into more details. But I think for now, it seems this is good. And you can also try our Earth Mission platform just to see how EUDR reporting looks like. For now, like I mentioned in the previous live as well, we have a couple of free credits, which we're making sure to provide for early users. So if you're interested in trying out a platform or seeing how EUDR reporting looks like or works, so you can just create your account and then you can play around with it, fill in some dummy data, or you can also fill in the real data, because the data, because we wouldn't have any access to your information, and you can generate the reports. So, and you can also share the feedback if there is any improvements you think which can be added to the platform. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me or any of our team members with your questions. So we would be more than happy to guide you or help you. Or if you have any feedbacks or suggestions or any improvements, we are more than happy to take into account for next iteration or developments. So yeah, this is about EUDR, and hope this was useful. And yeah, At least you have an idea about what is EUDR in a very high level. I understand it's a lot, but yeah. So I think see you again in the next session, which we are planning again maybe next year. And with that, I also wish everyone at once a happy new year from the entire Artha Mission team. And yeah, see you all soon again. Thank you so much.